My dear students, welcome to Virtual Classroom. I am your English teacher, Dr. Ramyabrata Chakraborty. Today I have a plan to start a virtual lesson from your English textbook, Hornbill, and I expect everyone to be attentive. As we all know that an online classroom cannot be a proper substitute to physical classes, but because of present pandemic crisis, we must cope up with the new digital method of classroom study. So, your sincerity and enthusiasm are highly needed. One important message I want to convey at the very outset is that while attending a virtual class in English or in other subjects, you must ready with your textbooks. Otherwise, you cannot get the real taste of the classes. So, when you start the video, the textbook should be opened in front of you. Now, let us start with the first lesson of the text Hornbill, and you are perhaps well acquainted with the title of the lesson. Yes, it is The Portrait of a Lady. This prose piece is written by Khushwant Singh. Before exploring the text, we are to learn something about the author. Now, Khushwant Singh is a famous Indian English writer. This is the photograph of Khushwant Singh. He was an Indian author, lawyer, diplomat, journalist, and politician. His experience in the 1947 partition of India inspired him to write Train to Pakistan in 1956, which became his most well-known novel. And one important information is that this particular novel was made into film in 1998 and it was well appreciated by everyone. His birth name was Khushal Singh. In English, it means prosperous lion, and that name was actually given to him by his grandmother Lakshmi Devi. Now, this name Lakshmi Devi is very important here. Actually, our author will be talking about his grandmother Lakshmi Devi in this particular piece. Born in Punjab, Khushwant Singh was educated in Modern School, New Delhi, St. Stephen's College, and graduated from Government College, Lahore. He earned an LLB from King's College, London, and was called to the bar at the London Inner Temple. After working as a lawyer in Lahore High Court for 8 years, he joined the Indian Foreign Service upon the independence of India from British Empire in 1947. He was appointed journalist in the All India Radio in 1951 and then moved to the Department of Mass Communications of UNESCO at Paris in 1956. These last two careers actually encouraged him to pursue a literary career. As a writer, he was best known for his transient secularism, humor, sarcasm, and an abiding love of poetry. These are the features of his writing: secularism, humor, sarcasm. Sarcasm means irony. His comparisons of social and behavioral characteristics of Westerners and Indians are laced with acid wit. He served as the editor of several literary and news magazines, as well as two newspapers through the 1970s and 1980s. Between 1980 to 1986, he served as Member of Parliament in Rajya Sabha, the upper house of the Parliament of India. Khushwant Singh was awarded the Padma Bhushan in 1974. However, he returned the award in 1984 in protest against Operation Blue Star, in which the Indian Army raided Amritsar. Actually, this incident reveals his rebel-mindedness. In 2007, he was awarded the Padma Vibhushan, the second highest civilian award in India. Singh died of natural causes on 20th March 2014 at his Delhi residence at the age of 99. His death was mourned by many, including the President, Vice President, and Prime Minister of India. Now, these are a little biography of Khushbant Singh. If you want to learn more about that fellow, you can go through the other sources, web sources, as well as book. Now, it is time to discuss the text, the portrait of a lady. Now, before entering the text, I have to say something about the title of the text. At the very outset, when we go through the title, we can imagine something. Now, what is our imagination? We have not yet started the text, but seeing the title, we can guess something. Now, what are the things? The things are that the title of the lesson is Portrait of the Lady, that is the picture or photograph of a lady. But in this lesson, we cannot see any photograph. This is very interesting. But in reality, this particular lesson is a lifelike portrait of the author's grandmother. In this lesson, we will get to know how the author has drawn a portrait of his grandmother with pen and tried to unfold the beautiful relationship with her while telling the readers about his grandmother's appearance and daily basis activities. We will get to know more about the appearance of the old grandmother whom the author has described using beautiful metaphors like young and pretty, etc. The author has thrown some light over the initial years when he used to live with his grandmother in the village and their life there, and his life in the city became the turning point in their relationship. So, from the title, we can actually expect something. We can expect an excellent pen picture of a particular lady, and that particular lady is nothing but the author's grandmother, Lakshmi Devi, and this particular description or delineation of the lady will give us a real interesting story of that lady and his relation and her relationship with author. Now we are to explore the sentences of the text. I am entering the lesson, the portrait of the lady, and it starts with a beautiful sentence. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmothers, was an old woman. Now, I have already told you, you are to keep your textbook handy. Now, this very first sentence is remarkable. I have to explain the significance of the very first sentence. The very first sentence of the lesson denotes the commonplaceness of the subject matter of the lesson. It prepares us to read the story and relate it to our personal experiences so that we can get delight to enter the text. This is one aspect. Another aspect is that from the literary point of view, the first sentence is an instance of the definition of literature. I always love it. That is, literature is a journey from particular to universal. Here, the author Khushban Singh starts telling about his grandmother, and it reminds us of our own grandmothers. And thus, the particular grandmother of the author transforms into universal grandmother, your grandmother, my grandmother, his, her, everyone's grandmother. And herein lies the real charm of literature. Now, another interesting aspect of the first sentence is that it is very much explosive to give us an idea of the narrative style of the story. And this story, The Portrait of a Lady, is written in first person and is in the autobiographical mode by use of the expression my grandmother. So, the very first sentence is very important in this particular lesson, and it actually prepares us to enter the text with our full enthusiasm and interest. Now, coming back to the text, she had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. Now, for the 20 years, it actually reflects the very age of the author when he wrote the particular story. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. Actually, this expression reflects the childlike simplicity. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. There is a digression. Now, the author is narrating about his grandfather. Now, grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece. Here, we have come across a new word. We have to know the meaning of this particular word, mantelpiece. Now, what is mantelpiece? Mantelpiece means a statue of wood, marble, or stone above and around a fireplace. You have to make note of this. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. He means author's grandfather. This is the dress up of author's grandfather. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. Now, this is the physical appearance or physical description of author's grandfather. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. Humorous statement. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. Now, these are underlined because we have to explain these particular expressions. Now, what this particular expression says, these lines are an excellent expression of child psychology. A child lacks rational faculty. That's why the author as a child thought his grandfather didn't seem like a man who could have a wife and children, but someone who could have lots of grandchildren. Now, in one hand, it reflects the child psychology, and on the other, this particular statement actually reflects the author's use of humor. Now, coming back to old grandmother, the author says, as for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. Now, thought was almost revolting. Why the thought was almost revolting that author's grandmother was once being old and being pretty and beautiful? Because the author's grandmother was very old and wrinkled. She had stayed at this stage for the last 20 years, and people said that once she was young and pretty, the author could not even imagine her being young. So the thought was revolting to him. That is, it resulted a confusion or contradiction to the author. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. Now, this is usual practice in village-centric India, where the grandmother, grandfather, they used to share some stories, some folk tales to the children, and she often told author and other children the stories of her childhood, and that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part. Now, absurd, this is a new word, and we have to understand the meaning of the word. Absurd is nothing but illogical. Absurd is illogical. Now, when grandmother actually narrated her story of childhood to author and other children, this seemed illogical and undignified. Why undignified? Now, they thought that the old woman actually telling lie. Now, for an old woman to tell lie is something not dignified, undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. Now, we have to understand what is fable. Now, fable is nothing but a short story that tells a moral truth, often using animals as characters. The examples are, you are well aware of the examples, the grasshopper and the ant, the fox and the grapes, and on and on. Actually, the main motto is that fables are naturally imaginary or fictitious stories, but intent of these fables are to generate morality. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. Now, in these lines, the author actually describes the physical features of the lady. Khushban Singh recalls his grandmother as short, fat, and slightly bent. Her silver hair was scattered untidily on her wrinkled face. Coming back to the text, no, we were certain she had been always as we had known her, old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older, and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. Now, how is it possible? A person remains in his same age for 20 years. It is because at the old age, the growth of an individual is stopped, and he or she stays at same until death, means the final decay. That's why the author says that his grandmother remains same for 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. But she was always beautiful. Now, this is an excellent expression. Now in physical class, actually I devote whole class in explaining this particular expression. Now for your convenience, I am explaining it simply. Now pretty is transitory, but beauty is eternal. Now here is a contradiction between two words. One is pretty, other is beautiful. Now to me, pretty is transitory, but beauty is eternal. The first one, that is pretty, relates to the body, and the second one, that is beauty, relates to the mind. Our body decays, but our mind always remains the same. We cannot define beauty. That's why we cannot define beauty. It is about the mind. So we cannot define beauty. It depends on the viewer's perception. The grandmother did not create any physical attraction, although she is a class of beauty. Clear? She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Now, in this particular sentence, we have come across so many new expressions and words. Now, first of all, hobbled. Now, what is the meaning of the word hobble? And we have to understand it. Hobbled means walked awkwardly because of pain. Now, it is happening to the grandmother because of her excessive age. She always walked awkwardly about the house in spotless white. Now, by spotless white, what the author actually intends? By spotless white, author actually denotes neat and clean white cloth or shari of the grandmother, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop so that she could stand, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Now telling the beads of her rosary, it actually signifies the religious mindedness of the author's grandmother. Now telling the beads of rosary means counting the beads of rosary while reciting prayer. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Now, puckered, this is a new word. Now, what is the meaning of the word puckered? Puckered means wrinkled. Puckered face means wrinkled face of author's grandmother. Now, she had the habit of reciting regularly, but it cannot be heard. Inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. Now, the author actually recognizes her beauty. Now, this is the beauty of mind. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains. An excellent comparison. She is like the winter landscape in the mountains. A simile, an expanse of pure white serenity. An expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. Now, an expanse of pure white serenity, what does the expression actually mean? The author compares his grandmother's serene face to that of a white winter landscape, as white color symbolizes peace and contentment. Now, contentment means nothing but satisfaction, a mental satisfaction. Now, white winter landscape means white landscape. The landscape covered with frost, white landscape. And white is nothing but the symbol of purity. So, according to author, she is beautiful. She is the excellent symbol of purity and beauty. My grandmother and I were good friends. This is about the relationship of author's grandmother and the author. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. Now we have to explain these particular statements. These statements actually highlight the depth of relationship between the author and his grandmother. The bond or the depth of relationship started after the author's parents had left for town, keeping the author under the care of his grandmother. Now, actually, the relationship or depth of relationship started from this spot of time. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. No problem here. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice but never bothered to learn it. Actually, she, the grandmother, helped the author to get ready for school. Now, when she bathed the author or dressed up the author, she used to utter the beautiful divine song, but her intention was that the author could get a moral sense from these songs. But in reality, the author was reluctant to get the moral message because of the particular age of the author, but he always loved to hear her voice, and so he always heard the beautiful song uttered by his grandmother. Then she would fetch my wooden slate. Now, fetch, what's the meaning of the fetch? Now, fetch means to go and bring. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle, and hand it to me. After a breakfast of a thick, stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. Now, there are two things which may be explained. The first one is a breakfast of a thick stale chapatis with a little butter and sugar spread on it. Now, what actually this particular expression means or highlights, the expression highlights the simple lifestyle of the author as a child. The meaning of the word stale is not fresh. The author had the habit to consume simple breakfast of a thin chapati or roti with butter and sugar, and the roti was not always fresh. Actually, the grandmother wanted to cultivate the seed of simple living and high thinking, the great motto in author from his very childhood. Clear? She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. Now, this particular expression denotes what? This particular expression denotes the grandmother's love towards animals, and it is also a religious trait, as religion always says to be equal compassionate towards human beings and other birds and beasts. It reminds us Swami Vivekananda's famous saying that one who serves birds and beasts equally, ultimately he or she is serving the God. Coming back to the text, my grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer, while the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda, singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. My grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. Now, scriptures, you understand, scriptures are holy writings, religious writings or books. As for example, the Upanishads, the Quran, the Bible, the Tripitaka, etc. Now, why author's grandmother escorted him to school? Now, one is naturally the care. The other is, which is very important, the school was attached to the temple. And as author's grandmother was a religious minded woman, she loved to go with the author at school. And the priest, actually priest is the teacher, or priest was the teacher there, when priest used to teach them alphabet and other things, at that time author's grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures, holy writings. When we had both finished, means the author finished his study and grandmother finished reading the scriptures, we would walk back to home together. This time the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. Now, growling, this is perhaps a new word for maximum of the student. The meaning of the word growling is hostile sound produced by a dog. Now, while returning home, the street dogs actually followed them because of the chapatis. Okay. Now I have to finish today here, and we'll continue the lesson in our next virtual class. Thank you. Stay home, stay safe.